Hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Cannabis, Legalization, and Youth, a topic that many Canadians are talking about this year. Today's session is part of a webinar series by University of Calgary scholars. Information presented is a summary of the scholars' research. Please submit questions during the webinar by using the Q&A box on the left side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can during the session. You'll see some additional resources listed on the right of your screen, so please do take a look at those as well. If you're on Twitter, please keep the conversation going using the hashtag #ExploreUCalgary. Afterwards, give us your feedback. Through the survey, it's located on the lower side of your screen or through the clipboard icon. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. I'm joined by Dr. Matt Hill, who is an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Cell Biology and Anatomy in the Cumming School of Medicine. He is a member of the Hotchkiss Brain Institute and Matheson Center for Mental Health Research and Education, and the Executive Director of the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids. That is a mouthful. Dr. Hill studies neural mechanisms by which endocannabinoids modulate stress and anxiety. You can follow him on Twitter at canna_brain. And Dr. Rebecca Haynes-Saw is an assistant professor in the Cumming School of Medicine's Department of Community Health Sciences and a member of the O'Brien Institute for Public Health and Matheson Center for Mental Health Research and Education. Her research examines adolescent mental health and substance abuse through the lens of a critical health approach with a particular focus on youth cannabis use. You can follow her on Twitter at Rebecca Saw. Welcome to both of you. And now, before we get started, we'd like to see who's in the audience with us today. So we have a little poll for you to tell us who you are. If you want to take a moment and indicate any that apply to you, if you're a health researcher, policy researcher, working in healthcare, just interested in the topic, we'd love to know. Matt and Rebecca, is there a group that you typically see more interested in the topic that we're talking about today?
I'd say it's pretty expansive. Every walk of life. I mean, we've talked with academic crowds, general public, criminal justice system. You probably have more experience.
Yeah, a lot of public health practitioners are people working on the front lines, I think, and want to stay up to date with the evidence. Yeah,
I feel like everyone wants to know.
It's such a good topic right now. So let's see who's in the audience with us now. A lot of working in healthcare and health researchers. So it's a good group for the presentations today. And now let me turn it over to Dr. Hill to get the presentation started.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so I'm a neuroscientist, as the introduction went. So I study the endocannabinoid system. For those of you who don't know what this is the brain has its own version of a chemical signaling system that's similar to THC from cannabis. And it makes its own molecules that are kind of like THC. This is very similar to things like endorphins. So people tend to be very familiar with endorphins. If we burn our hand, we release endorphins so that we don't feel pain as much and helps us deal with that aspect. So the brain makes chemicals that are like THC that are similar, and our research has shown that they get released when we get stressed out and they help to calm us down. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is a little different. This is something that I've had some tangential experience in doing research with, but it's something that is a very hot topic right now, and that's trying to understand the impact of cannabinoids on the developing adolescent brain. And I say this because there has been a speaking point that has kind of made its way around the media quite a bit. Politicians really like to use this. And I find it an interesting one because they always say brain scientists tell us that cannabis damages the developing brain. It's always interesting when, as a group, you're quoted without people really definitively saying things like this. So I thought a good thing to use this webinar for and to talk about today was kind of, what is the evidence behind this claim, and is it valid? Are people overstretching themselves when they say this, or is there a lot of grounds for significant concern? And so I think what I hope to do is to just kind of walk us through some of what we really know and where this evidence has come from. So I'm a basic scientist. I do animal research. So I'm going to start off just highlighting some of the animal studies because this is really where a lot of the information that's discussed comes from. And the main point of this is that people who talk about this in the media really like to highlight the fact that they say that there's a substantial body of animal research which has demonstrated that exposure of the adolescent brain to cannabinoids causes permanent damage. And now I just kind of want to explain what some of this is based on. And so how these studies generally are done is usually they have rodents, mice or rats, that get exposed to drugs such as THC, but not always THC. Quite often it's synthetic cannabinoids that activate the same receptor as THC. And they administer them on a daily, sometimes twice a day basis throughout kind of what is the equivalent of a rodent adolescent period. And that's based mostly on when they go into puberty and things like this. And then what they do is they look at the impact this has on various aspects of brain development. And what some of these studies have found, and I emphasize that it's some but not all, because the data in this area, as we'll see in the human studies as well, is very spread out, and it's very different. And the problem right now is that we really don't understand why everyone's seeing such different effects. But basically what we do see and what gets emphasized is that there is several studies that have demonstrated that if an animal is exposed to cannabinoids during this adolescent period of brain development, we see some differences in the kind of normative developmental patterns of the brain. And most often what this is seen in is that cells in the brain called neurons, which have all these branches like a tree, seem less complex. That's quite often. And that's what an image I have here is an example from one paper that came out a few years ago where they administered THC during an adolescent window and found that these neurons had less complexity to them. And so the interpretation of that was that there had been an impairing effect on the way that the brain had developed, and now these neurons weren't as functional as they normally would be. And that tends to be the speaking point that people go to. So as an animal researcher, though, and someone who's seen a lot of these studies and has admittedly done some of them myself, and I think as science is always evolving, we understand limitations to things that we had said and done before as we move forward. And I think it's important to kind of point out some of the caveats associated with this, just so that people are aware where the evidence is coming from. So I say but, because I think there are 3 points that are relevant here. The first one is that a lot of these studies have not actually used THC. They've used synthetic cannabinoids. Now, as a field, because of regulation issues around THC, that's part of the reason why people have opted to use synthetic cannabinoids. They're easier to access, and they bind to the same receptor. So most people hadn't really thought that this was going to be fundamentally different than what we would see with THC. Now, since synthetic cannabinoids have hit the black market in humans, we've learned very readily this is not cannabis. There have been a significant amount of mortalities associated with synthetic cannabinoid use. There have been a lot of other adverse health outcomes, such as changes in heart rate or problems of other drugs being introduced. Even there's a recent one going around about an anticoagulant that's been spiked into some synthetic cannabinoids, and people have had, they just start bleeding. And so there's all these other drug problems that come around with it. But basically what we now know very clearly is that synthetic cannabinoids are not the same as THC. And so data that we have that's based on the use of synthetic cannabinoids makes it somewhat tricky for us to interpret that and explicitly state this is the same thing that's going to happen with THC. Because the way these drugs bind to the receptor and influence cell properties, we now know is fundamentally different. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is almost all of these studies have been based on THC. And as a field, we have been studying THC in isolation for quite some time. Scientists, we like to reduce things to singular variables so we can study them more easily. And since THC had been identified as the psychoactive constituent of cannabis, this kind of became the forefront of where people were studying. But what we know now, again, because this is an evolving field, is that cannabis is a lot more than THC. We know there are upwards of 70 to over 100 possibly other cannabinoid molecules that are present in cannabis. There is other terpenes and other organic molecules whose biological activity we really don't truly understand. And only over the last few years have people really started paying attention to some of the other components of cannabis. The one that's really hit the public is cannabidiol, or what's popularly known as CBD. And CBD is another component that's found in cannabis. It's actually at very low rates in street cannabis, just because the way that the cannabis plant will either make THC or cannabidiol comes from the same precursor. So it's very hard, as cannabis has been bred more and more to become high in THC, the consequence is it's also become lower and lower in CBD. But what we do know is that the presence of CBD modifies the effects of THC, and there's been some interesting human work where they've just administered THC, looked at an outcome, and also given someone CBD at the same time and shown that it does modify the effects of THC. And we are slowly getting some biochemical understanding of how this might happen. But the point of this is looking at the effects of THC in isolation may be misrepresentative of what the effects of cannabis as a whole plant are in terms of the biological effects. And I think the third and very important point is that in a lot of these studies, the dose and route of administration is not reflective of how humans use cannabis. And so now, not all these studies are guilty of the dose issue, but a lot of studies do use excessively high doses of THC or these synthetic cannabinoids to the point where it's not even remotely realistic that a human would ever consume that amount in one sitting. And so, not surprisingly, these studies do show very robust effects, but it's kind of a sledgehammer. So it would be the equivalent of, for example, giving an animal exposure to, say, an entire bottle of tequila in a single administration without letting them self-titrate or dose it, and then being shocked that having that much, active constituent of a molecule like alcohol would have such a dramatic effect on the brain. So the dosing has been an issue, and the route of administration has been an issue. So pretty much every animal study that's been done to date has been done via injection-based studies. Now the problem with that is we know that the way that the body handles components of cannabis is very different depending on the route of administration. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there from people who have smoked or vaporized versus eaten, for example. And even just having an oral route of consumption versus a smoked or vaporized route that goes pulmonary has fundamentally different effects. And the reason this is the case is because if it goes through a pulmonary route, it enters immediately into the bloodstream. It can hit the brain, so THC will hit the brain as it is. If it goes through the liver, it's getting metabolized into other molecules which have different bioactivity than what we see from smoked cannabis. And so having an injected version of THC or synthetic cannabinoid administered to an animal is going to go through the liver and produce a different kind of outcome of effects. It might be more representative of what you'd see from oral administration, but again, when you start considering the dosing aspects in there, it's very problematic. And so I think a movement in the field now going forward, and this certainly seems to be the push from any funding agencies that are wanting to look at translational science that's going to really understand the impacts of recreational cannabis, is we need to move to studies that actually try to mimic the human routes of administration. And so this would most likely use vapor chambers, which are accessible for animal research, using whole cannabis or whole cannabis extracts to model what's being used on the street as opposed to just isolated THC. And I think as these studies start to evolve, and there's some very interesting stuff coming out right now in the States, for example, Washington State and in Florida there is, and in La Jolla down at Scripps, there's some very interesting work that's coming out using vaporized versions of these compounds, which I think will give us a lot more insight into the outcomes. So it's not to say that there is no value in what's come out of the animal work. It's just that it needs to be taken with a grain of salt and understanding what the limitations of these data are, especially when we're using them to guide political policies. And so, okay, so that's the animal stuff. And then I'll just quickly touch on the human studies. And similarly, there are a lot of issues with the human studies. But similar to what we've seen in the animal studies, and what's permeated into the media, is that, again, I would say some but not all of the human studies have suggested that cannabis use during adolescence can result in this persistent change in brain structure, as well as kind of a long-lasting impairment in cognitive function or lower IQ. And so this is just an example from one paper that was looking at structural brain imaging or functional brain imaging. But basically, similar to the animal studies, there are a lot of caveats that need to be considered in here. And most people in this field recognize that these are very significant limitations to these aspects of the studies. The first important point, I think, for this is that in these studies, who they identify as a cannabis user often represents a fundamentally different group of people than what they are comparing it to in their control group. And what I mean by that is that these two groups do not differ simply on a variable of one uses cannabis and one doesn't. They are usually quite different. The group that uses cannabis quite often drinks a significant amount more alcohol, consumes a lot more nicotine in cigarettes, and uses a lot more recreational drugs, hallucinogens, stimulants, depressants, prescription medications. These kind of things, they do tend to cluster together. But outside of co-current other substance use, you do have other issues that could influence a lot of these outcomes, such as lower socioeconomic status. There does tend to be some differences in the way that these groups are stratified. There are usually baseline differences in education, which could certainly influence a lot of the outcomes related to cognitive function and IQ, given that those variables are heavily influenced by the level of education of the individual. And some of the other things that have popped up repeatedly is a male-female ratio issue that has come up in these studies. Very often, the cannabis using group is very heavily, predominantly male, about 2/3 male, 1/3 female, while the control group tends to almost be the other way around, where it's about 2/3 female, 1/3 male. And that's not true for all studies. Some studies do a better job of controlling these variables, but at large, these issues of lack of control have kind of plagued a lot of these studies. The other problem is the majority of these studies are retrospective in nature, and they're not prospective. What I mean by that is they're basically putting out a survey call for people who have used cannabis as a teenager and then bringing them in and looking at differences related to either IQ, cognitive function, or doing brain scans. They're not prospective in the sense that they recruit someone when they're a kid and then track them through their development to establish baseline differences and then understand differential trajectories that might naturally occur even in the absence of drugs. And I'll get back to this point in a minute because I think this is very salient for some of these. And the other issue that has arisen, and this isn't true for just this area, but this is, I mean, it's become something that's developed a lot of media attention in science, is just there's some replication issues. And I'm going to highlight this in the next few slides. And so the next slide here that I'm going to point out is from a paper that was done from Ken Hutchison's lab in Colorado. And basically what they did was they wanted to really understand, sorting through the mess of what's in the literature and say, is there really effective either adolescent or adult cannabis use on brain structure? And so to do this, they decided to do a very careful job of stratifying their groups. So not only did they try and match them on male-female ratios, they matched them very cleanly on alcohol use, cigarette use, other substance use. They matched them on measures of impulsivity and interaction with the criminal justice system, education. So almost all these variables that could in and of themselves produce differential outcomes. But then what they did, which is another thing that a lot of other studies did not do, was they wanted to make sure that the definition of what constitutes cannabis use can be very variable from study to study. So sometimes they just basically ask people, have you ever used cannabis? Or do you use daily? And they don't have a very clean gradient of definition of what a cannabis user is. So in this study by Hutchinson, what they did is they actually loaded the deck in their favor to explicitly try and identify daily cannabis users. This way they were comparing non-users who were stratified with daily cannabis users on all other variables. So really, if there was going to be a signal, they really loaded the deck in their favor to try and find it. But the first thing that they did was they actually took, and what you can see in this slide here, was they took all of the published data to date on structural brain imaging, and they put it in one graph so that everyone could see how all these studies look. And essentially what these studies are, what you can see here is everything that's on the left of the midline is a study that has found that the impact of cannabis, it's so small, is suggesting that the cannabis reduces the volume of a brain structure of interest that's listed on the far left. And anything that's on the right of the midline suggests that cannabis use actually increases the size of a brain structure. And what you can see just from looking at that is the data is really all over the place. So if you cherry-picked a singular study and said, look at this, this study found that cannabis use causes a reduction in the hippocampus, or this study found that cannabis use causes an increase in the nucleus accumbens, which has been stated, then individually, this looks like there's something really robust, but what happens if you actually look at all the aggregated data, which is that bar in the bottom, which I've now highlighted in the red circle, that is all of the data collapsed together. And what you see is when you put everything together, essentially it all washes itself out. And this is often what happens, and this is why things that we call meta-analyses in science, where you take a whole bunch of studies that have asked a similar question, you put their data together to basically say, is something that one study saw, does that hold on a bigger level? And the outcome of this is that it really didn't. But then on top of that, if you actually look at their data, which I've now highlighted in the red circle there, this is the data they had from their very carefully controlled study. And essentially what they found was they could not detect a signal of structural changes in the brain of individuals who were teenagers who were smoking cannabis on a daily basis. So this is a relatively high level of use group as well, and they still were unable to detect an effect on brain structure. So in many ways, this kind of called into question whether or not cannabis in and of itself was a variable that was going to damage the developing trajectory of a brain. When we look at things like IQ or cognitive measures, we see a very similar outcome. And this paper here, which I'm going to highlight, got a lot of press a few years ago when it came out because it had this flashy headline, which basically said that cannabis users show this kind of neuropsychological decline and impairments in IQ when they're adults, even if they stopped using it. There was these persistent effects. Now, this paper, when it came out, garnered a fair amount of controversy because its effects were, what they had detected was not consistent with what a lot of other people had reported. And there again, as I highlighted before, there were some very notable issues associated with the groups that they had shown up. They weren't exactly stratified on a lot of measures, particularly when it looked at things like educational the level of education they had completed. So what was interesting is in the next few years, because that paper came out, I believe, in 2012, was there was a series of papers which tried to follow this up, including one from the original research group, none of whom were actually able to replicate that original finding. Now, two of those groups, the way that they approached it was they did a twin study. And so they took groups of identical twins, and they looked at ones who'd used cannabis versus those that didn't. So this way you have a biological control group, essentially. So you can look at if changes that were associated, if you're doing a retrospective study looking back, at least this way you can look at if someone who had the same biological makeup exhibited the same trajectory with cannabis or without. And essentially what they found was that the shifts in intelligence and IQ that had been documented in cannabis users were found in the non-using identical twin, suggesting that this was more related to a biological predisposition or perhaps a pre-existing difference between these populations. The other approach was to look at doing a prospective approach. And one of these studies here did that, where they actually looked at baseline levels of IQ. They did a study looking at kids and then tracked them through adolescence. And basically what they found was, yes, there was lower IQ associated with cannabis users, but it was a pre-existing difference that occurred before they had actually begun using cannabis. And so this kind of highlights some of the methodological issues. Now, it's not to say that there isn't a difference between individuals who use cannabis and don't, because it's possible that some of these other variables could contribute to initiation of use. But it's to make a statement explicitly stating that cannabis use as a teenager causes residual and somewhat permanent effects on cognitive function and brain structure is misleading in the absence of recognizing the limitations of these studies. And I think the other thing that goes along with this is quite recently there was a very large-scale meta-analysis study that kind of looked at all the studies that had looked at adolescent cannabis use and cognitive function in adulthood. And what they found, very similar to these individual failed replication studies, was when you put all the data together, there was no signal there. And so they were not able to actually find a signal saying, if you smoked cannabis as a teenager, you had persistent cognitive impairments as you grew up. And in fact, what that meta-analysis found was studies that had identified residual effects were almost entirely related to ongoing cannabis use. And once someone abstained from cannabis for a few days, all these other measures went back to normal. And that's not surprising because there are very well documented short-term effects of cannabis use on working memory and other cognitive processes. So it was important to just emphasize, I think, that there really isn't a substantive amount of literature that supports this conclusion.
How old were the children in the meta-analysis?
All varying ages. So you do have some that were starting initiation quite young. You had some that were older. And I'll kind of highlight some other nuances as I finish this up about age that might come into play here. But the last point I want to make before I kind of go into the conclusions is this isn't to say that there isn't risk for cannabis. It's just what these data are looking at are kind of aggregated data of an overall population, kind of 30,000-foot view of what we see here when we look at the data. But there was a really interesting study that came out of Toronto, actually, from Thomas Paus's lab a few years ago, and they looked at cortical thinning. And this is how thick your cerebral cortex is. The general dogma would be the more your cortex thins out, that's a negative thing. And so they looked at how cortical thinning related to both genetic risk, so using these polygenic risk scores, where they look at genes that have been associated with risk for schizophrenia, and they create an increasing load score, as well as cannabis use, and how these variables independently or interactively related to cortical thinning. And what you can see when you look at this figure on the left, everything left of the dotted line, I guess that's my left, I'm not sure. It's where the red circle is now. These are individuals who have no genetic risk for schizophrenia, or they load very low on possessing any of these gene SNPs that are related to the risk for schizophrenia. And what you see here in the solid line, which is the cannabis users, is there's absolutely no difference from the controls, which is the dotted line, which are the never used cannabis before. So there's no differences in cortical thickness. Again, if there's no biological predisposition to see something. But what you do see on the other side of the graph with that red circle that I just added there is these are the individuals which have an increasing load of genetic risk for schizophrenia. And what you see here is that individuals who consumed cannabis as a teenager did exhibit some degree of cortical thinning. So what this means is not entirely clear at this time. There's a very obvious relationship between cannabis use and schizophrenia that is not entirely understood at this time. I think these data add to it, and it does suggest that perhaps some of the biological variables that might predispose someone to develop schizophrenia may also predispose someone to become more vulnerable to adverse effects of cannabis use, especially during the adolescent period. Why that is, we don't really understand at this point, but it's kind of generally become a well-recognized contraindication of cannabis use is that you should not be using cannabis if you have a known genetic or biological risk for developing schizophrenia, because there is a signal there suggesting that these two may relate in some capacity. So to conclude, I'll just kind of wrap up the main points of what it is that I've been trying to review today. And the first one is, I would say, the current state of evidence does not support the blanket statement that recreational cannabis use by adolescents causes irreparable brain damage or persistent impairments in cognitive function in the average person. And I emphasize this. This is not a statement of saying that it's safe and it's not dangerous. And I'll highlight some of the other risks we do know that are associated with adolescent cannabis use in a second. This is a point I'm making, and I'm making this just because I've heard this reiterated in the media and from even at public town hall events. There was one where a psychiatrist was giving a talk, and a student or a young individual in the audience stood up and asked them, I smoked cannabis as a teenager. Based on what you're saying, do I have to worry about long-term brain damage? And the person's response was yes. And he told this 20-odd-year-old kid that he had permanently damaged his brain now because he had smoked cannabis as a teenager. And I thought that was wholly irresponsible of an authority figure to be telling someone without any substantive evidence, even though they had only used it for a transient period in their life, they'd stop now, that they had now done permanent damage that they would never be able to recover to themselves. And so I would really appreciate messaging shifting to be more consistent with scientific policy, or scientific findings at least. And we know that alarmist and scare tactic approaches don't work for messaging, and teenagers nowadays have a lot of agency. They are fully enabled to go online and search scientific databases themselves to understand what the real evidence is out there. And so being honest and straightforward with them about what we understand, in my view, is a much more appropriate approach to education. This is obviously uncomfortable with some people, and that's understandable, but I think it's a conversation worth having and how we move forward in terms of drug education. I do want to point out, this is, again, I'm emphasizing this is not an endorsement that cannabis is a safe drug. I'm not saying that in any capacity. We do know there are other variables that can increase the risk of adverse effects happening from cannabis. Co-substance use. We know that alcohol and cannabis interact on a biological level. This is something that has not had a lot of research to it, but every study that's been done really shows that there is an exponential interaction between these two drugs being co-administered. So we really need to understand that in a much greater way. There's a very great likelihood, in my mind, that either early life or concurrent life stress could be a very significant interacting factor. We know one of the main motivations for use of cannabis is to try and manage feelings of stress and anxiety. And so you could have teenagers who begin using in a form to self-medicate in some capacity, but could lose control. One of the biggest risk factors for developing cannabis dependency is having social anxiety disorder and using cannabis to manage it. Because if this is done in a non-restrained way, you can develop escalation of use patterns, which can become highly problematic. And then again, as I emphasized with the cortical thinning study, genetics and other biological variables, which unfortunately we don't truly understand yet, could obviously set the stage to make some subgroups of the population much more vulnerable to the adverse effects of cannabis versus others.
So would you say that there's an ideal age with beginning cannabis use, or it's more based on genetics and background?
Well, if individuals choose to use cannabis, I think I'm going to put in a plug for the low-risk cannabis use guidelines at the end of this. But I think that the messaging that they use in there is probably the best. I don't think you can ever say there's an ideal age to start using any substance at. Obviously, the best way to reduce any risk whatsoever is to abstain. That's not really a reasonable approach for the most part in the general public. So I think the safest thing to say is just delay as long as possible for onset of use. We know that the earlier you start, the more likely you are to develop dependency. So individuals who start smoking cannabis, especially males before the age of 15, especially if they use high THC concentration cannabis, they have a phenomenally higher risk ratio of developing cannabis dependency than most others in the population. And so there are a lot of other risks that are associated with it. I just feel that we should be structuring our messaging around those real tangible risks as opposed to things that may or may not be very solid, such as the changes in brain structure or cognitive function. And so There's other research as well that's been done in the Netherlands, which is really interesting, where they were looking at academic achievement. And they did see, they had a group they did prospectively, and they did see that they had, looking at grades and academic achievement, pre-cannabis use. Once they started using cannabis, they did notice a bit of a decline that was significant that emerged. So again, it's another thing to consider that's not something you're going to pick up per se on a brain scan or an IQ test, is that there are other influences that could happen in one's life that could be considered adverse or detrimental. So again, I emphasize the messaging to just be consistent with the science that's been done well and that we know. So again, like I said, I wanted to plug the low-risk cannabis use guidelines because I think that they provide a very strong and rational framework for us to understand the best ways to go about reducing risk associated with cannabis. I find that this has been very effective for alcohol. We know roughly, the advice on not to consume more than X amount of alcohol, especially if you're a male or a female, because that increases risks associated with both dependency and adverse health outcomes. So I think following the low-risk cannabis use guidelines are actually quite a good way to go. But the last thing I just wanted to mention is, and I say this simply because, and Rebecca will do a really good job of building on this much more than I'm going to, but the reason that we've been doing a lot of these talks is because this has become a huge talking point in the government, is the impact of cannabis on the developing brain and how it's basically going to jack up rates of mental health, mental illness issues. It's going to create a generation of teenagers that have permanent brain damage and low IQ, which is, I can't view as anything more than gross fear-mongering. And so the question is, really, should we be worried? I'm trying to put identify to you what the scientific evidence is saying to date about what we understand about the impacts of the brain and IQ, which are limited and foggy at best. But I think the main point we have to say is legalization has no impact from any identifiable metric that I've seen on changing use rates in teenagers. So Canada, again, Rebecca will do a much better job of this, but Canada already has a pretty high rate of cannabis use among adolescents. And the other thing I find bizarre is this conversation that we have. It seems to be in a vacuum that right now we're starting at a 0 point where no one uses cannabis. And suddenly when legalization occurs, everyone's going to use cannabis. And therefore we're going to see this massive delta.
We're legalizing, not inventing it.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very bizarre approach. And so these data that came out of Colorado I thought were very interesting. And this is Deborah Hassan, who's at the School of Public Health in Columbia University, has done a lot of epidemiological data in the United States. And basically, when they look at use rates among states that are either fully illegal, have medical access, or full recreational, you don't see changes in use patterns among teenagers. You do see use changes in some of the older demographics, particularly 55 plus, which I find quite interesting. But you don't really see it in the teenagers. And so, as Shakespeare said, sometimes it's much ado about nothing. I feel like we've got a lot of hype going on for something that there's not really a lot of evidence to support there being a massive public health concern about. And I think that's a good segue for Rebecca.
Great, thanks, Max. Okay. Yeah, so to piggyback on Matt's excellent, myth busting and breaking down of the limitations of the science, what I want to do today quite quickly is just give the policy context for this change as someone who's been working in this arena for many years and been studying, the harmful effects of cannabis prohibition policies, and been someone working with some of the people who've been the architects of arguing for this policy change. So there is a solid evidence-based rationale for this change, and I'm going to try and also break down 3 of the top myths about what we'll see with youth and what the current situation is with youth and cannabis use. And I just want to say I've learned a tremendous amount myself from collaborating with Matt and understanding more in depth the neuroscientific evidence, because like he just laid out for us, there's studies that get reported on in the media and the papers, and then sort of everyone in public health or parents or other communities might be like, wow, that seems very concerning. Without having that disciplinary training and background, it's very hard to unpack these studies. Well, the same thing goes for the public health evidence and understanding changes at the population level versus changes individual health outcomes and harms. And so I think that it is very important to understand the public health policy approach and context to this issue for that reason. So essentially, just to summarize, the policy context for this change, as I've mentioned, is that prohibition has failed. In fact, we could call it a colossal policy failure. If you have a policy that criminalizes a certain activity, but yet over 50% of your population says that they've engaged in this activity in their lifetimes, you pretty much have a marker that that policy is not effective. And you're devoting a lot of resources to law enforcement, to policing, to arresting, to the courts, diversion programs, but you're still not seeing that impact, because beyond lifetime use, you might have 20 to 25% of people saying they're using this on a regular basis, right? So we know that prohibition has not been successful for this substance, not deterred use at all. What's also concerning, primarily from our public health lens, is that the supply is unregulated. So a lot of people said, well, why don't we just decriminalize the substance like other places have done? Why do we have to make it legal? But in a decriminalized model, what most people don't know about the Amsterdam model is that the supply chain of that cannabis is unregulated and illegal. Now, there's lots of generational family farmers growing cannabis in a responsible way, but the whole aspect of the supply chain, from growth to the concentrations to how it gets there and it's transported, whether it's contaminated, all of that is unregulated, right? So we're looking for a regulated supply that we know is safer in terms, and also people have that knowledge about what they're consuming and what the contents are and can make better choices. The other thing that I think people neglect so frequently is that criminalization has tangible, real harms for people's life courses and trajectories. And I'm really looking forward to post-legalization, when we hear about Canadians from all walks of life who've experienced these harms and because of the stigma have not come out and say, you know what, I have a possession charge from my youth. It prevented me from going to the United States. It prevented certain job opportunities. And I also like to say, you know, as an everyday Canadian, if I have a possession charge, I can't even volunteer at my children's school. I can't coach their soccer team. I can't chaperone field trips. And if I want to apply for a pardon, it's a myriad of paperwork and a $600 fee. So you can see the inequities there for the 500,000 plus Canadians. Like, this is a significant amount of Canadians who have these charges, not for trafficking, but for possession. Right? The other thing we know, finally, from the public health approach is that the harms associated at the population level are much lesser for cannabis than they are for other legal substances like alcohol and tobacco. Okay, so I'm going to unpack 3 of the biggest myths, and that is that legalization will not protect public health in youth, assuming that once we legalize, rates will go up and harms will increase. As we've seen from the Colorado situation, that hasn't been the case, and we don't have data to suggest this. That setting the legal age of access high is the best way to prevent youth from using. I'll show some data around that. And that our educational approaches should only address abstinence and no use. And that's something that Matt spoke to as well. So one of the things, if you look at the data from our Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Use Survey, and also Canadian Cannabis Survey, is that we already have an incredibly high baseline and a high rate of use amongst young people. So this actually sets the context for making this policy change, right? As I've said, it's not deterring use. So you see that use is concentrated amongst those 20 to 24. And the numbers in the Canadian Cannabis Use Survey are larger because it's not nationally representative and they oversample people likely to use cannabis. So what this tells me is if you set the age at 25, as some people like the Canadian Medical Association have suggested, you're effectively shutting out the bulk of your demographic of users from a legal and regulated supply. Again, that would be a colossal policy failure to legalize something, but the majority of people who are using it cannot access the legal supply. The other thing I'd like to remind people, as we haven't seen the upward trend in cannabis use post-legalization, is that we are on a downward trend for cannabis use in our province and in many jurisdictions. And that's because of some of the effects we hypothesize. We don't have clear explanations as to why, but we've done some universal prevention in schools, right? So we have seen rates of alcohol come down. And very significantly in Alberta, cannabis use rates amongst high schoolers 15 to 19 have halved in the past decade. So it isn't the situation that everybody who's a young person is using drugs in an increasing amount, right? We have had that downward trend. Finally, as I've already mentioned, one thing that hasn't come down is criminal arrest rates for people 18 plus in our country. And even as legalization was being announced and we were moving towards this change, we are still seeing, upwards of 50,000, 40,000 people being arrested yearly. And again, this is for possession for personal use, not for trafficking. Now, just last week after I did these slides, we saw the 2017 numbers come out, and those are down to 14,000. So that tells you that law enforcement has backed off on prosecuting and arresting people as we're moving towards this change, but to me that's still way too high. I think right now we should have no one being arrested for possession in Canada.
Do you think with the legal age question still, whether it's going to be, will you still be affected, do you think, by not being able to purchase Even if the legal age is 18, 19, will they still be accessing unregulated?
So what was built into the federal legislation, and then it's up to provincial jurisdiction, is that youth possession has been decriminalized. So you'll see a lot of conservative pundits say 12-year-olds can legally possess cannabis. That is not the case. We're now going to treat it like alcohol. So under 5 grams, which is about 10 joints, if a youth is caught with that, they'll receive a ticket. Their guardians will be notified, and cannabis will be confiscated. That's what we're doing in Alberta. So in effect, we're changing that trajectory for them, and that they're not going to have a permanent legal record for something, much like alcohol and tobacco. So I just show this chart. It's from David Nutt and colleagues in the Lancet in 2010. It was a very influential drug policy paper because they got some of the world's leading experts in drug policy and the effects of drugs together to rate the harms at the population level and at the individual level of various substances. And what you can see for this is that overwhelmingly, alcohol is the most harmful substance. It's associated with the most social harms and individual harms in terms of aggression, violence, intimate partner violence, motor vehicle crashes, being drunk and disorderly. We know this from alcohol. Cannabis is much lesser, in fact, lesser than tobacco. At about 20 out of 100 is the ranking of harms. So this is not saying that cannabis is safe and benign for everyone, I think, as Matt has laid out, but saying if we look across the population, it really isn't associated with the level of harms that other legal substances are. So there is an evidence base for making this public health policy change. So this is the model that we use called the paradox of prohibition. In looking at, for this substance in cannabis, if you look up to the left-hand side, when a substance is illegal and controlled by an illicit market or the black market, or here they use the term gangsterism, in a prohibition model, it's unregulated and associated with more harms. However, if we swing over to the other side, to my right, the Colorado model, where capitalism and commercialism is very unchecked, that can also be associated with harms because you're saying, everyone should use cannabis all the time. We're going to have a myriad of cannabis products. We're going to have lollipops and gummy bears. This is also not a public health approach to cannabis. So we're looking for that midpoint, that sweet spot, and that's what Canada's policy framework has been based on. Legalization with strict regulation, not legalization and everybody has, unfettered access. That is the approach that we're taking. And so when people cite these Colorado statistics, even though we've done that here to reassure ourselves, when they cite the statistics about harms, we have to say we're having an even more strict model than Colorado and other U.S. states, so we may see even less use and harms. Okay. So what we know from the National Academy's Medicine Review, and I think Matt's summarized some of this, but I just want to reassure people, this looked at 10,000 studies and case reports, and specifically to youth, we know that most young people who are using cannabis do so infrequently without negative health or social outcomes. So that's the nature of the substance and the way that it's used. It's a drug of young people. Most people are using 20 to 25, and then that use is tapering off. And there are those subsets of the population who use becomes problematic, but this is not the norm for most people. And those trajectories of use, I don't know if you mentioned this already, but it's associated with being young and being male, but also with tobacco use. So young men who initiate smoking at a young age also are more likely to be on that trajectory of problematic cannabis use. And as someone who works with youth in a population, health scientists like to say, this kind of makes sense from the human perspective. If someone is initiating substances early adolescence, 13 to 15, there's a lot of stuff going on in their context other than just their, biological or genetic vulnerabilities. There's probably a lack of parental monitoring. There may be a peer context where substance use is really encouraged. And so there's other risk factors in their environment that we really need to account for other than just what's happening with the effects of the substance. So my colleagues at Center for Addiction Mental Health published this commentary series in the International Journal of Drug Policy, a really influential journal in our field, talking about Canada's rationale, public health rationale for this approach. And they use this great analogy that I always share is that, we need to think about public health beyond protection. And is keeping something illegal the best way to protect youth? And they make the claim that we have great epidemiological evidence at this point that hockey is quite harmful to the developing brain based on, head injury and head trauma. But we don't make hockey illegal. No. We don't say you have to be 25 plus to play hockey. Why? Because hockey is part of our culture. It's normalized. It's part of our social activities. And I'd like to argue that drug use is also normalized. Alcohol is normalized. We look at the evidence on prevalence. cannabis is pretty much normalized. So this is part of society. We're not going to regulate it away by making it legal. We want to make it regulated and legal and safe to keep our population safer, right? And to know that what they're using is a safer supply, and to do better public health education. There's not much we can say to young people when we say it's illegal. In this new context, we can say different things.
It at least opens up a conversation.
Yeah.
Positive space.
Yeah, so on that note, just to sum up here, I want to highlight our lower risk cannabis use guidelines, which are evidence-based and review of studies of most of the behavioral approaches associated with cannabis, and how people could reduce their risks and who exactly is vulnerable. And as we've already talked about, specific to young people, what we say is the best thing is that we need to delay use as long as possible. So and when we talk about early adolescence, it is that window of 13 to 15, right? Our prevalence data shows that the average age of initiation in Canada is high. It's about 17.6 years, close to what we'll see in the legal age for most provinces and jurisdictions, right? And then it's about frequency and intensity of use, right? So how often are people using? What is the type of dose they're using, and how high is the THC concentration? There are ways, I think, through these guidelines to communicate that you can reduce risks, that we don't need to focus on abstinence only. And that's really important for a harm reduction approach, a pragmatic approach to keeping people safer.
And how do you measure what is a harm? Is it a visit to the ER? Is it a very problematic experience?
I mean, that's another great thing. We're still laying the research agenda for the indicators that we'll measure around the impacts of legalization and public health harms. And some of these are harms to self, and some of these are harms to other. So yes, it's an uptick for health services. If you're seeing more people presenting at the ED because they're having a negative experience, an anxiety or potential, temporary episode of psychosis from a high THC product, or maybe they're having another experience that's not life-threatening, like cyclic vomiting, right? So that is a harm to our health services and to the individual. But one of the more positive things is that we're not seeing overdose from cannabis, right? I think the harm that most people are concerned about is motor vehicle accidents or using cannabis with other substances and having negative effects. But we don't see mortality associated as we do with other substances, especially for young people. There's only been 2 or 3 cases from that National Academy's report of pediatric ingestants that they found cannabis. So it may have been one of the factors contributing to a young person being hospitalized. Right? So that's positive in some ways. So finally, I'll just summarize my points moving forward, talking to youth and talking to parents. If you're a social service provider, a practitioner, or just a concerned citizen and want to talk to people you care about cannabis and cannabis use in the context of legalization, I want to reassure you that talking about drugs does not lead people to use drugs. Substance use epidemiology shows us, the factors that are linked to drug use are linked to context, but also to a range of other individual variables, right? So just like talking to your child about sex does not lead them to go out and have sex, we need to have these conversations with people and not be afraid in this new context. We need to listen to youth. We need to have credible and actionable tools for young people that are not scaremongering, that are not blaming people. And I just want to highlight, this is about education for empowerment, not for abstinence and prevention. And then finally, I think we both touched on a lot of problematic drug use is tied to what's going on in someone's context. So for me, the issue is not the drug. It's about how do we strengthen communities and how do we bolster the things that wrap around young people. So I don't think cannabis is the single variable that will alter someone's trajectory if there's a range of other supports for them in their family life, their school life, and their community.
And can you elaborate a bit on what those other biological variables that you mentioned, what would they be, and how they may cause adverse effects in cannabis use?
Right. So, I mean, the most frequent one that we hear about and talk about is young people at risk for schizophrenia, right? So for that subset of the population in our low risk guidelines, we say, in our layperson guide, if you or your family members have had a history of severe mental illness, especially schizophrenia, it's probably a good idea to talk to the young person in your life about not using cannabis or not initiating cannabis. We don't know the causal pathway, but we know that there's a robust association there. So we have enough evidence that we're comfortable saying these are some people who should probably abstain.
Yeah, and I mean, from a biological level, as Rebecca said, we really don't know what these signals are. There's some theories that it could have to do with, say, gene variants and how the cannabinoid receptor, the THC axon, is expressed. So maybe some people have a gene variant that make it express in different cell types or more abundance in certain cell types than it normally does in the brain, and therefore it makes the brain more sensitive to THC exposure. We're not exactly sure what it is, but there does tend to be those. And I mean, in an ideal setting, you'd be able to say, oh, you'd be able to identify something and say, oh, if you have this gene variant, you shouldn't use cannabis. It's very difficult to actually do any research that has a conclusive outcome like that, which is why I think using statements that are more just as it is right now in the low-risk cannabis use guidelines, and it's also through the Health Canada thing. If there is a history of psychosis or bipolar in your family, which we know is a risk factor for an individual to develop schizophrenia, avoid. In that situation, abstinence probably is a much more conservative and appropriate approach.
And I think one of the other things that we often hear is that cannabis is a gateway drug to harder substances. Are there studies that show the relationship to that, or is that something that has been largely overblown? Or
I think we both have opinions on this, so I'll go first and you can jump in as well. I would say there's really not a lot of evidence that I've ever seen that supports this. I feel like there is a general misinterpretation that is, in my mind, just a logical flaw that people have made, which is people don't often go from doing nothing to doing cocaine or heroin. That's just not something that generally happens. There is naturally a progression that will occur as either through sensation seeking or, as Rebecca said, through context. Someone's trying to distract themselves from things in their life that they don't enjoy, that are very stressful, and they start using substances as an escape route, perhaps. But in those situations, cannabis, as is alcohol and tobacco, is what I would refer to as a kind of entry-level drug. They're just things that are more socially acceptable, they're more accessible. And so the first substance that someone usually tries is something that they can easily access. And as Rebecca's pointed out, even in the current model of prohibition, that doesn't block access to cannabis. And in some situations, it may actually make it easier because there are less regulations around it. And so, like, for example, when I was a teenager, trying to get alcohol, I found to be quite problematic because you had to go to a liquor store, you had to find someone who was old enough. If you had, older siblings, that might help. But in most cases, it actually was quite difficult to get access to something that didn't have a viable black market and was under, federal regulation. And so I find it very frustrating when people refer to it. They said, oh, well, they started on cannabis and then they moved into other things. And it's like, yeah, but they also, almost every single time they started on cannabis, they also started on alcohol and tobacco. Yeah. And I think some of the modeling work Fiona's done has even statistically shown that there's no relationship and there's no predictive value as to whether someone used cannabis if they would go down a trajectory of harder drugs.
I think we can safely say the gateway theory's been debunked. That's what most people would say at this point. As Matt said, it's the first substance illegal substance that most people are able to access. It was a theory originating with Denise Kandel in the U.S. several years ago, and now we've kind of moved away from that. My colleague Akwasia Wusu-Bempa is a great criminologist from U of T, says, it is actually a gateway drug, but it's a gateway to the criminal justice system. So what most people don't realize is if you're a 16-year-old with a possession charge, you can get put into a diversion program. You can go to a special school, a special educational program where it's a collection of people who've used drugs and committed crimes. And so you just set on this pathway of the state intervening in your life and being labeled as a problem youth who uses illegal drugs. And that is actually a serious gateway effect. So in removing this, we'll be able to follow youth and see has this changed for them when they don't have the stigma and the harms of the criminal charge.
Yeah, and I think along the lines of that, the other thing that I think I would say it is a gateway to is access to other drugs. Because currently cannabis is illegal, teenagers or anyone going to access it will have to go to an illegal market. And when they do that, that gives them access to a drug dealer who will then open the doors to other substances. Yeah. And so you don't get that. If you go to buy beer at a liquor store, you go in, there's beer and there's spirits and there's wine and stuff, but you don't get exposed to all these other drugs. And when you have to use a black market as a means of access, it actually does open the door to exposure to a lot of other substances. And I think that's why, as you said, it's the most accessible legal substance. Yeah. That's that does open these doors to what I would call more of a pipeline to get access to harder substances.
Yeah. We have a question as well that for Dr. Saad, that Colorado and Washington found that legalization is linked to spikes in cannabis and impaired auto crashes. Do you have any policy tools that could curb that trend in Canada, or is that something that's coming out?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really controversial issue, and it's actually one of the ones I hate talking about the most because personally I have a visual impairment and I don't drive. So I think to avoid like the whole driving conversation, Matt has some great insights on this too. I want to caution people that there's a certain partisan research body called the Rocky Mountain District Health Authority who publishes these very alarmist reports on the Colorado data, and they are a very explicitly anti-legalization group. And so just the other week someone emailed about this and said, this is shocking, I'm very scared about what this report is showing. But it is very much cherry picking the data.
Yeah.
Cannabis impaired driving is already happening, and what the National Academy's report showed is that it is there is a strong association there, but the rates are happening among young men who are predisposed to speeding and to alcohol use at the same time when you look at the postmortem data. So I think we really need to unpack this. We need to have public health messaging about, hey, if you're going to get high, don't drive for a window of I think 6 to 8 hours is what we recommend, especially for novice users who are not experienced. So there are those concerns, but I think we need to just step back and say we're not going to see an epidemic of high drivers on the roads, any more so than the risk we already see of alcohol-related crashes.
I think this is an important point because one of the other things is that, and I find this very frustrating, is when comments like this that come out about this, they're actually not based in data. So earlier this year, in April, there was a paper that came out that published all the traffic vehicle fatalities in Colorado and Washington State in the years prior to legalization, the years after legalization, and then compared to neighboring states that did not have legalization. And what they showed was there was absolutely no impact of legalization on traffic vehicle fatalities at all. And the point, as Rebecca makes, from, I think, groups that are very rampantly anti-legalization, what they try and point out is they manipulate data that's there to make it sound like it supports their arguments. Like they say, oh, well, these post-mortem detections of THC have gone up 20-fold since legalization happened in these motor vehicle fatalities. And the problem with that is cannabis and THC, especially THC, but the other ones, but that's usually what comes up on a tox screen, is not like alcohol or cocaine. It does not have a short half-life. Someone who uses cannabis can test positive for up to a month after using the substance. If they're a regular user, they have a reasonable amount of body fat where THC and other cannabinoids will store, you can test positive in a tox screen for up to a month after use. And there is no relationships between presence of THC in fluids and intoxication rates. And so what they have found is, yes, it wasn't surprising that more people tested positive for having THC after legalization happened. That was not a relationship to a causal association with more motor vehicle accidents. And I think, as Rebecca pointed out, there already, and this is one of the arguments they had in Colorado, was there are already a lot of people who are driving on the roads intoxicated on cannabis. And the thing that I always find amazing is someone says, oh, well, legalization is going to change this. I'm thinking the subset of the population that is choosing to not use cannabis because of its legal status is not going to be the ones who decide to go out and get high and drive. They're the ones who are going to be the most conservative with their use patterns. And that's the demographic that's going to shift post-legalization, not the ones who already use cannabis. And so, again, it's this weird discussion that people have, that there's a vacuum of like a zero baseline and suddenly things are going to change. And there is no data to support the majority of these claims.
And someone asked on Twitter about CBD-infused beer, which I did not know was
I just heard about
thing.
this. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
I feel like this is gimmicky, to be honest. First of all, I'm not really clear what that would do. I mean, I know CBD has become a big, like it's very hyped in the public right now, and people are using it for almost everything, from sleep to pain to inflammation. There is very sparing clinical evidence to actually support a lot of these claims, but it's fine if it's being treated as a natural health product, which it seems to be. People are going to use it the way they use vitamin C and some other things that they feel are very beneficial. I don't really get why it would be spiked in beer, because CBD is also not psychoactive. It's not THC, so you can consume mass amounts of CBD as long as it's actually pure CBD, which oils aren't, because there are always going to be extracts that have THC in them. But if you actually consume pure CBD, you can consume a fair amount and not have any psychoactive effects from it whatsoever. So I'm not really clear what the point of spiking beer with it even would be. I also feel like there'd be some issues because it's a lipid. I don't see how you're going to get it to just comfortably sit in a solution of beer, which is an aqueous solution. But
and innovation.
Yeah, maybe, because if you put oil in, just think of that. It's just oil would just separate and sit on top.
But this is like another argument against this, commercialization of every aspect of this plant. And I understand, like, this is going to be a legal, regulated industry, and people, entrepreneurs and people in industry need to make money and diversify products. But it's that idea of marketing, a psychoactive substance that's associated with harms, which is alcohol, with CBD, which is being perceived as a natural health or wellness product, and sort of the problematics that come up from that. So from a strict public health approach, we would say, well, maybe that's not a product that's needed. I'm very, supportive of people having access to cannabis and a safe supply of cannabis and being able to consume. But I'm not so sure that people need a cannabis product, THC or CBD, for every aspect of their lifestyle, right? So we need to find that spot where we're able to have a legal, thriving industry, but that we're not marketing it as for every mood and for every moment of your day you have an opportunity to use.
That's great. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Matt, for sharing that research and for answering our questions. They were great. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. We hope you enjoyed it as well. Don't forget to fill out the brief survey and share your feedback with us. You'll find the survey on the bottom right of your screen or using the clipboard icon. If you enjoyed today's presentation, you can sign up for other webinars, download ebooks, and watch videos at ucalgary.ca/explore/collections. And if you have ideas on other webinar topics, please email us at exploreucalgary@ucalgary.ca. Thank you, everyone. We are signing off now, and we'll see you next time.